Well, hello everybody. Good afternoon. As many of you already know, welcome to this new session of this series of workshops on social analysis on penalty across borders. I am Máximo Sozzo. Is
Richard Spock.
So we are coordinating this since more than 2 years ago. Every last Wednesday of the month, we welcome somebody to present their work on these topics. So today we're very, very happy. We have Katherine Bruce-Lockhart with us she is an associate professor in history at the University of Waterloo in Canada. She has been working a lot on history of prisons, both in Uganda and in other places of the African continent, and more recently also in a new project on the involvement of UN and the construction of international standards and regulations around imprisonment. So we are really, really happy to have you here, Katherine. As we already told you, we will have 30 minutes for your presentations, followed by a Q&A. So we can start whenever you want. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. I'll just share my slides. So thank you so much for having me, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I know we probably have many time zones. It's still morning where I am, but it's really nice to be here, and it's great that this workshop is happening, and obviously it leads to some wonderful exchanges and dialogues, so I'm happy to be a part of it. Okay, so the title of my talk today is The Political Prison, Prisoners' Collective Action in Late Colonial Uganda. And on the screen here, we see an image from the colonial period. This was a parade of prison staff in front of colonial officials at Luzira Prison in Uganda, which is one of the prisons I will be talking about today. So around 12:30 p.m. on October 17th in 1955, prisoners at Kampala's Mengo Prison gathered in the main prison yard for their midday meal. This ended up being no ordinary lunchtime, however. That day, a radio had been placed in the yard so that prisoners could listen to the celebrations honoring the return of the Kabaka, Sir Edward Mutesa. You can see the Kabaka here. He's the man standing up in the car, and he was the Kabaka, or king, of Buganda Kingdom in Uganda, and he had just returned from exile in Britain. So this was a very important day in Kampala and in Uganda in general, and the excitement surrounding his arrival had permeated the whole capital city, with celebrations going all day and night. Within Mengo Prison, however, the celebration quickly turned into a crisis. As news of Mutesa's arrival was relayed over the airways, the prisoners who were gathering to eat their lunch reportedly began to, quote, arm themselves with missiles and stormed the gate. Nearly 600 prisoners were involved, making this the largest prison protest in Uganda's history, and perhaps one of the larger ones on the African continent in the colonial period. And I'll be discussing this and other collective actions by prisoners today in late colonial Uganda. So just a bit of an overview of what I'm going to be discussing today. First, I'll give you just a little bit of wider context, although you got some of that from the introduction, which is great, about my work and how this particular talk fits into that. I'll then discuss my frameworks and sources and methods, and then turn to prisons and politics in late colonial Uganda. And I'll focus specifically on two collective actions. Sometimes I'll refer to them as collective actions, sometimes as protests, still trying to think through terminology, trying to get away from the colonial language that's used, which is riot or uprising. And I'll look at those in two prisons, Mengo, which I just spoke about, and Luzira, which you saw on the first slide. And then I'll share some conclusions. So in terms of my wider work, generally speaking, I'm a global historian of prisons and punishment. I focus a lot on the African continent, specifically East Africa, but also other areas. And I guess first and foremost, I would argue, and I think this is something that most in this audience would agree with, for the importance of global frames of reference when we study prisons and punishment. Whether we're doing case studies of a specific prison or looking at a national prison system, there's always a high degree of interconnectedness, maybe more than people might think when we're looking at prisons and punishment. So having that global frame of reference is important. Within that, my priority is to try to center colonialism and the experiences of communities in the Global South in the wider global history of the prison, which is something that this workshop is certainly promoting, which is great to see. There are sort of two big questions that guide my general research. How did prisons become a global phenomenon, and what is the role of colonialism in this? And secondly, why did prisons persist after independence? Something that I think has often been taken for granted. And that was the main focus of my recent book, which you can see here on the screen. It came out a few years ago, and it looks at prisons, detention, and punishment in Uganda after independence in 1962. So I'm not talking about that today, but that's kind of some of the bigger themes of my work. I'm also interested in global and national dynamics, so how global conceptions and governance infrastructures influence prisons at a national or local level. And my current project looks at the history of the Nelson Mandela rules and what role the UN plays in shaping conceptions and practices of incarceration. Finally, I'm really interested in social histories of imprisonment and the experiences of incarcerated people, and that's very much what this paper is about. So for some context, there's a little bit of this in my book, but as the focus was on the post-colonial period, I didn't really have much space to devote to it. So I've been looking at this since maybe 2014 when I started my PhD. So it's time to give it a chance to stand on its own terms. So I realize not everyone here may be familiar with the history of Uganda, so here's just a little bit of background context. So Uganda, which is in East Africa, is home to many diverse communities and historically has had many different political systems prior to colonialism. For example, I've mentioned Buganda Kingdom, which was a highly centralized kingdom in the southern part of the country. And you can see a map here of Uganda. This is from the 1980s, but it gives you a general sense of some of the regions I'll be discussing. So Uganda experienced European imperialism from the mid-19th century onwards and became a British colony or protectorate specifically in the 1890s. It gained its independence in 1962, and the period that I looked at specifically in my book was between independence and 1986, which is when the current president, Yoweri Museveni, came to power. He is still in power to this day. And during those first few decades after independence was a time of tremendous change and upheaval. There were 7 governments. There was the mass expulsion of the South Asian community under Idi Amin, which many people might be familiar with Amin. And there were also 2 wars. So I won't be discussing that in detail today, but it's just some broader context for us to consider. So let's talk about the prison system in Uganda. So as was the case across much of the African continent and of course across much of the global South, prisons were a product of colonialism. There weren't formal prisons in Uganda prior to the arrival of the British. So prisons were at first set up in the 1890s, and they were set up by the British in collaboration with some elites from Buganda Kingdom. Now, again, this is fairly common. The prison service wasn't an autonomous entity when it was first set up. It was part of the military until 1908 and part of the police until 1938, which impacted the kind of training that was provided. So Uganda in the colonial period had 3 separate prison services, and this was due to the indirect rule model used by the British. So Uganda was unique in the sense that there were 3. Some other countries had 2, but due to the special status of Buganda Kingdom, there were actually 3 in Uganda. And again, there's a map here. This is from the post-colonial period, but there's a lot of similarities between the colonial and post-colonial, so it gives you a sense of sort of the density of different types of prison sites across the country. So the 3 services, there was the central government prisons, or the Uganda Prison Service, or UPS. These prisons were the largest prisons. They were in major cities and towns. They held all European and Asian prisoners, and then they held African prisoners serving long-term sentences. Then there were the local government prisons. These were smaller. They were spread throughout the country. They didn't have as clear rules. It was usually governed by a set of ad hoc rules and largely run by chiefs who were part of the indirect rule structure. Most people in local government prisons were sentenced to short-term sentences, largely for offenses such as the non-payment of poll taxes. And there was less formal training for staff in these institutions. Then there were the prisons of Buganda Kingdom, including Mengo, which is where this one major protest was held. These had a special status because of the unique position of Buganda Kingdom in the indirect rule structure. They were mostly small prisons, with the exception of Mengo. Prisoners were usually again held for short-term sentences, and quite a number of them were internal migrants from other parts of the country who had come to Buganda in search of economic opportunity. So now that you have that context, hopefully this will all be a little bit clearer moving forward. So one thing that's really interesting to note is that these collective actions or protests happened across all three prison services between 1955 and 1961. At my latest count, there were 7 collective mobilizations involving large groups of prisoners. I have 5 up here on the screen because these are the ones that we have the most information on in terms of the records. But they took place in a range of different prison sites, from large prisons in urban areas to small rural prisons. At least 1,000 incarcerated people were involved. The numbers are probably much higher. And these prisoners were made up of diverse backgrounds in terms of ethnicity, in terms of languages. They were serving various sentences. Some had been involved in political mobilizations outside of the prison, others hadn't. Most of them were convicted of criminal charges. And I'm going to be focusing on 2 of these mobilizations today: Mengo Prison, the first one in 1955, and Luzira Prison, which happened in 1960. So how am I approaching this prisoners' resistance or these collective actions? So as we'll all be familiar with here, historians and of course many other scholars in other fields have long been interested in how prisons became focal points of resistance and collective action, from the storming of the Bastille in revolutionary France to the uprising at Attica Prison in New York State in 1971. We can see an image of the Attica uprising here. There has been a great deal written, of course, about the role of prisons in anti-colonial movements and liberation struggles and on the African continent and also elsewhere. Within African studies and African history, a lot of attention has been paid to how post-colonial African politicians, such as Nelson Mandela, who's pictured here, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and others, spent time behind bars as they fought for freedom. These men were generally part of the professional classes, they'd often study abroad, and they were prominent political figures when they were incarcerated in many cases. We know a lot about their experiences because a lot of them wrote about them in memoirs, or they spoke about them when they were in positions of power after independence. So their experiences are particularly visible in the historical record and in public memory as well. But the events that I'm discussing today do not neatly map onto the familiar frames of reference for political imprisonment on the African continent. Most of the people that I'm discussing today lacked the legal or symbolic status of political prisoner. They weren't leading figures in African political parties involved in independence movements, and indeed they're rarely named in archives or known to the public. Their collective actions weren't necessarily explicitly framed as anti-colonial, and they were focusing on issues such as food, working conditions, violent treatment. At times, as I'll discuss, there were some connections to outside political mobilizations, but these weren't always very clear in the way they're presented in the archive. So how to approach this? I've been drawing a little bit on the work of Fran Buntman, who's done excellent work on the history of prisoners' resistance to apartheid on Robben Island in South Africa. And Buntman develops a typology of resistance in this book that you see on the screen here. And I'm simplifying this quite a bit. I'm not going to do full justice to this great work, but there's sort of 2 broad categories of resistance that I'm interested in from this. Oh, sorry, we'll go back there. The first is resistance as survival, which is basically about securing basic needs. So this is when prisoners aim to stop or slow the state's infringement of their rights and, where possible, improve the status quo. And indeed, a lot of what I'm discussing today mostly falls into this category. Then we have resistance beyond survival, and this is aimed at wider political transformations beyond the prison. So this is where, to quote Buntman, prisoners work on slowly but surely whittle away state power, develop and maintain the very organizations, political understandings, and sense of community that incarceration was meant to destroy. So she's talking specifically about leading figures like Mandela and others in the African National Congress and other groups involved in liberation struggles. So these are really valuable insights and a useful framework, but Buntman's focus is mainly on high-profile political prisoners and highly organized political movements with connections behind and beyond bars, which doesn't quite, again, work when we're looking at Uganda. And I think in general, when we focus on high-profile political prisoners and these highly organized political movements, which are of course very important, we can sometimes miss or gloss over the ways that other prisoners engage in anti-colonial politics in both direct and more subtle ways. So kind of small p politics. We often kind of overlook that, I think, especially in studies of the colonial period. So in terms of my sources, I'm a historian. Of course, there's going to be lots of archives involved in this research. So this research was mainly done through archives in Uganda and the UK. I'm looking a lot at official records, so state inquiries, prison reports, and correspondence, as well as newspaper articles in both Uganda and the UK, as well as there was some others that were included. And of course, it's important to critically approach these state materials and how one reads them. Certainly, protests in this case and many other cases generated a lot of paperwork, as officials struggled to mount a bureaucratic response to a political problem. Official accounts, the way I've read them, were very much shaped by the state's desire to make protests legible and containable. And we sort of see two different things happening in this paperwork. On the one hand, we see the downplaying of the collective agency of prisoners. Colonial administrators often dismissed the possibility of widespread organization and solidarity amongst people who were incarcerated, instead attributing the protests to a few bad apples. On the other hand, we see officials refusing to treat prisoners as anything but a collective. Prisoners were usually left unnamed in official reports, and their testimonies were not directly included. This was in keeping with wider colonial attitudes towards prisoners, with their complex identities being reduced to broad categories of criminality shaped by racist and gendered ideologies. As Paul Greedy, who also works on South Africa, has argued, incarcerated people are relentlessly rewritten within the official power of writing, with the state seeking to ensure that imprisonment is represented on its terms. So by reading official inquiries against the grain, we can push back against some of the erasures of the colonial archive and draw attention to the problematic and particular ways that the state tried to frame prisoners' actions. The second key aspect here is trying to center prisoners' perspectives, which I think is important in any work on the history of prisons. This is more challenging than in my previous work on the post-colonial period. In that work, I could interview people directly who had experienced incarceration. There were a lot more written materials such as memoirs and letters, and these are harder to come by in the colonial archive. So prisoners, as I said, were interviewed for these commissions of inquiry, such as the one you see on the screen, but no direct quotes were used, and those testimonies aren't available. One of the only times we learn about individual prisoners is in the Mengo report. We learn about the one prisoner who was killed by warders, a prisoner by the name of Kaloli, and all that we really know is that Kaloli was arrested for stealing a bicycle and breaking into a house, and that he was from outside the Buganda region. That's all we really know about his life. The only other time we actually learn about individual prisoners is the very graphic photographs of prisoners who have been assaulted by warders that are included in the state's report. They're not named. We don't know anything about their life. So I've been thinking about trying to see prisoners' collective actions in light of all of this and these challenges as an archive in and of themselves. So when prisoners use tactics such as strikes, escape attempts, and other demands for change, they force the state to respond and leave an indelible imprint in the archival record. So in the last half of my talk, we'll turn more to these collective mobilizations specifically and learn more about them. So in the time that these were unfolding in the 1950s and 1960s, early 1960s, this is a time of rising rhetoric about rights, reforms, and rules, both in Uganda, in the imperial arena, and also more globally. So in the 1930s, there were three major reviews of Uganda's prison services. One was just focused on Uganda, and two were part of wider imperial reviews. In the post-World War II period, at a broader British level, we see a wider colonial focus on development and welfare, more investment in prisons and other state institutions. And then globally, of course, by now, there are the standard minimum rules, the precursor to today's Mandela rules, which were developed in the 1920s and 1930s through the International Penal and Penitentiary Commission and the League of Nations. So with these different levels of action and performance on rights and reform, these kind of come together to lead to the Ugandan colonial authorities promising a lot of different reforms in the post-World War II period, such as limits to corporal punishment, improvements in diet, more training in prison farms and industry. You can see an image of a prison farm here on the screen, more specialized prison facilities, and the professionalization of staff. In practice, there was very limited implementation of these promised reforms, again, something that we see in many other cases. Partially, this is due to the outbreak of World War II, which put a lot of reforms on hold, but it's also due to the rising prison population. So in the aftermath of World War II, there were a lot of political mobilizations in Uganda. The end of the World War had ushered in a lot of economic challenges in Uganda, as well as rising grievances against the government. And this resulted in a lot of strikes, boycotts, attacks on government buildings, including prisons. So some of the local government prisons were actually attacked by protesters, which led to some prisoners being freed. Again, something that we see in different cases across the world. So rather than addressing the issues that had led to such mobilizations, the state responded with mass punishments, arresting, imprisoning, and deporting those who'd been involved. As a result, we see a massive rise in the prison population in the post-World War II period. So you can see a representation of this visually on the screen here. The population basically doubles during this period. So by 1960, there were 57,000 prisoners held across the three services. And this led Uganda's prison system to be in a state of extreme crisis. Now, this provides us with more understanding of why these collective mobilizations are happening behind bars. People who were engaged in strikes and boycotts were being put into prison. This was then exacerbating existing issues, leading to extreme overcrowding and worsening of conditions. So Mengo, the one that I mentioned at the beginning, was one of the first prisons that was built in Uganda. It was set up by the British, as I said, in the early colonial period. By October of 1955, when this mobilization happened, Mengo had nearly 600 prisoners, even though it only had accommodation for 250. The catalyst for this uprising, as I said, was the release of a select group of prisoners who were meant to be freed in order to mark the return of the Kabaka. Now, prisoners had actually gained access to information ahead of time about who was supposed to be released. It was meant to be a secret, but apparently there was some leak between the prison staff and the prisoners. So to try to minimize tensions for those prisoners who weren't meant to be released, the prison staff allowed them to gather in the yard to listen to the celebrations on the radio. They said they would give them extra rations that day, cigarettes, and also empty petrol drums so they could, I guess, drum along in celebration. I'm not quite sure what the logic was there. But this didn't work. Following the announcement of the Kabaka's arrival on the radio, the prisoners reportedly armed themselves with mugs, plates, and bricks from the kitchen and the prison yard. Outnumbered, the warders quickly hid in the cells and the bathrooms. The prisoners then surrounded the gatekeeper, taking his keys and opening the main gate, but they were met by armed warders immediately on the outside who'd been stationed there in case of any disturbances. The prisoners then reportedly went back into their cells without too much issue, but a number of warders then went around to the cells and identified 16 prisoners who they felt were leading it. And then they dragged those prisoners out of those cells, took them outside of the prison gate, and brutally assaulted them. This resulted in the death of the Kaloli, the prisoner that I mentioned earlier, and the rest were severely injured. So as a result of both the protest and the beatings that happened afterwards, the state launched a commission of inquiry. It focused a lot on the actions of the warders. Some of them were imprisoned. The head of the prison lost his job, but they really downplayed the significance of the actual prisoners' mobilization. So in my own analysis, I would say the trajectory of this protest suggests that it wasn't a spontaneous event. Nearly 600 prisoners acted together, suggesting a high degree of planning and communication. They knew about the proposed release ahead of time. They had chosen to start their takeover as the Kabaka's return was being announced over the radio, and they'd identified which objects could be used as weapons. After the fact, many of them even came forward to share their accounts of the warders' abuse, despite documented risk of violent reprisals. So we see a lot of solidarity and collective action here. Now, the government said that they would, again, implement a lot of reforms, including building a new prison to lessen the issues of overcrowding. But we continue to see further mobilization at this and other prisons. So just 2 years later, in 1957, for example, quote, serious disturbances were reported at Mengo twice that year, with prisoners protesting over longstanding issues such as the low rates of remission, the bad quality of the food, overcrowding, and the long periods spent awaiting trial. So Mengo continues to be a major site of protest. So the second major incident that I'll look at as I wrap up was what happened in Luzira Prison in 1960. So Luzira Prison was built in 1927. It was part of the Uganda Prison Service, or the Central Prison Service. And in this prison, prisoners were mostly held together in large cells that could accommodate about 80 prisoners at one time. So there wasn't a lot of separation of different prisoners. Luzira was and is Uganda's main maximum security prison. It still operates today, and it remains Uganda's most notorious prison, with lots of high-profile politicians, for example, being imprisoned there throughout history. So official concerns about Luzira had been growing throughout the post-World War II period, as it was the primary destination for those arrested for anti-government protests. In the 1956 annual report, for example, a few years before these incidents took place, colonial officials expressed their worry about the rising prison population. They said, and I quote from the screen, "The overcrowding at the central prison Luzira was such that the conditions were cause for grave anxiety. There was ever present a real danger of breakdown of discipline caused by the events during the year, the overcrowding, and lack of suitable occupation of prisoners." So due to these concerns, the government launched, yet again, a commission of inquiry, very common tool at this time. And they found that basically the prison was not running effectively at all. Prisoners, particularly or only prisoners who were European or Asian, were running the prison as staff in part. A lot of the staff didn't have proper training. There was extensive trafficking in unauthorized items. There was lots of bribes with prisoners and warders, and inadequate facilities. And this made news back in the UK. So you can see an article here in the Times about some of the issues in Luzira. So the government knew there were lots of problems. They fired the commissioner of prisons as a result. But Luzira just kept getting more and more crowded as the state was arresting more and more people who were involved in these mobilizations. So what happened in Luzira in 1960? In July and August of that year, there were a series of altercations between prisoners and warders. So on July 29th, a prisoner alleged that he was, quote, deliberately assaulted by warders. Hearing this news, the other prisoners refused to eat their food or go back to their cells, as they saw the incident, and I quote here, as an unprovoked assault on a fellow prisoner. A few days later, there was a second incident where a prisoner allegedly attacked a warder in retaliation for what had happened earlier. Following these two incidents, we see the colonial authorities, the prison authorities, deciding to have an inspection of prisoners' cells to root out potential weapons and avoid any further incidents. In response to this, prisoners declared a strike. They refused to go to their cells to work or to eat. The commissioner brought in a riot squad on standby, and prisoners agreed to meet with the commissioner and share their grievances, which included things like a lack of food, a lack of bedding, unsafe labor conditions like working in the heavy rain, severe overcrowding, limited access to goods such as coffee and tea, and also notebooks, which was seen as really important. Indeed, it came out in the report that one of the prisoners had actually written to local newspapers about what was going on, about these protests and these assaults. And so there was quite a bit of coverage in the local press, which made the government pretty nervous, especially when anti-colonial groups such as the UPC or the Uganda People's Congress started drawing attention to what was happening in the prisons. So this is where we start to see a more direct connection between politics inside and outside of prisons and anti-colonial movements. So once again, the government launches an investigation into what's happened at Luzira, And in the report, they dismissed the prisoners' claims of assault. They said these were exaggerated. And instead, the government said that these incidents were designed to, and I quote, stir up embarrassment to the government. They said these incidents were organized by a small, hardcore group of prisoners who had been involved in outside protests, and that they were trying to bring disgrace to the government of Uganda. So again, here there's more political motivations attributed to the prisoners, but they're only limiting it to a very small group, and again, kind of discounting this wider solidarity. So again, the government promises reforms and changes. Better training for the warders, opening more prisons once again to try and reduce overcrowding. Issues at Luzira persist though. That same year, 10 prisoners actually escape, and there's a massive search throughout the whole city to try to find them. And Uganda gets independence 2 years later, and then a lot of these problems continue to persist. And this image on the screen here is an image from the colonial period of prisoners helping with chain link fencing inside of one of the prison facilities in Luzira. All right, so some conclusions to tie this all together. So I think that these uprisings reveal the diverse motivations and modes of political engagement in late colonial carceral spaces in Uganda. These were led by prisoners with a range of concerns, claims, and collectivities. Despite their differences in ethnicity, language, sentence length, and proximity to release, these prisoners came together over shared grievances, including deplorable conditions, violent treatment by staff, and labor exploitation. So in practice, if we think about this bigger global context and also the specific imperial context, they are demanding and articulating basic needs and rights as set out in the standard minimum rules of the League of Nations at this point, even if they're not necessarily framed explicitly with these wider global reference points. They could have been, for all we know. We don't have access to what the prisoners said. But in practice, when we look at what they're doing, these kind of frameworks are being applied. So they mobilize collectively for better conditions inside of the prison and better futures outside, turning prisons into really important sites of dissent and disruption, making it very, very hard for the government to govern in a time of rising political unrest. Through their actions, they showed the emptiness of this wider imperial rhetoric on reform and rights, and showed how it wasn't happening in practice. The state's response fell into a lot of familiar patterns that we see not only in the colonial period, but to this day. Rather than seeking alternatives to incarceration or dealing with the political and economic inequalities that had led people both behind and beyond bars to protest, the government expanded their punitive infrastructure. They built more prisons. So what about after independence? And I have an image here of Idi Amin at the prison service on the screen here. Initially, many of these prisoners were acknowledged as heroes. So as independence, as we were getting closer to independence in October of 1962, different political parties, including the UPC, who had power, were calling for the mass release of prisoners who'd been arrested for their involvement in these boycotts and strikes. On the night of independence, the government released thousands of prisoners who were, in their words, involved in offenses arising from political affairs. So this was a big part of Independence Day celebrations. But yet, in the long term and short term, unfortunately, we see many continuities in terms of how the post-colonial state dealt with dissent, the use of states of emergency, the use of mass arrests as well. So we see familiar patterns here when we think across the colonial and post-colonial world period, and also across different parts of the world, right? Wider carceral logics that not only shape colonial practices, but also persist around the world today. And I think finally, this history just reminds us of the importance of taking seriously the myriad ways that incarcerated people contest these practices and take collective action. Thanks so much.